This is episode 318 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am pleased to be joined this week by Ken Costello. Ken is a regulatory economist and independent consultant with the Rio Grande Foundation, and he studies issues in utilities and utility regulation. Welcome back to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Ken.
Thank you, Paul. My pleasure.
Yeah, there is a lot going on in utility, kind of issues these days, and I wanted to have you on. Of course, the centerpiece of our discussion is going to be around the Avangrid PNM merger and what promises and perils that has in store for New Mexicans. But of course, we've had a lot of talk of issues on the Western power grid with reliability, and there's also coal-fired power plants in the Four Corners that, if they are closed, could affect that reliability and whatnot. So there is a lot going on, but I think the place to start here is with the Avangrid PNM merger. And that is a issue that the Rio Grande Foundation really hasn't taken a position on, but there's a lot of side issues within that issue that we do have some pretty strong feelings and concerns about. And I wanted to get your take on some of the issues, but can you briefly just describe PNM? We all know PNM here in New Mexico, the largest publicly traded company in the state, our biggest utility provider. But what has your experience been, or knowledge what is your knowledge, I should say, of Avangrid and its kind of expertise and background?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Paul. First of all, I'd like to say I'm not a party to that case, so I'm just an interested person who have nothing at stake other than I'm a customer of PNM. Avangrid is actually operates under an umbrella of a holding international or foreign company, Iberdrola, a Spanish company. Avangrid itself operates, I think, in in 6 states where they own their regulated utilities in the Northeast. This is their first venture into a new area in the United States. They also own different subsidiaries, and a major one has to do with wind. I think they're like the 3rd largest producer of wind energy in the country. Okay, so they bring that expertise into this merger, and something that I guess PNM sort of values because, as your listeners know, that because of the Energy Transition Act, New Mexico is going to have to sort of shift towards renewable energy, including wind, over the next several years. In terms of reputation, that there's been some concern that some of their operations in the East as a regulated utility have been sort of subpar in terms of providing reliability to the customers. They've been penalized, I think, in New York and Maine, and maybe some other states, for providing poor service to their customers. And that is sort of a later issue in the current docket before the PRC that various parties have raised as, if they came in here taking over PNM, there's a chance that service reliability would worsen. And that's an important issue because if you look at the impact on customers, there's really 2 major things: the price, what's going to happen to the price of electricity, if they assume ownership, and number 2 is the quality of service, which includes reliability that they provide. something I could talk about later is that under the current stipulation between PNM and some of the parties, PNM has um, uh, committed to reporting on reliability and work with staff and actually be accountable if the commission feels that the service is below what it should be, then they could be penalized. So in my opinion, what they're committing to is adequate to also, to sort of respond to that concern. It is an important concern, reliability. PNM has, I would say, a good reputation, at least in my mind. It may not be true with other people, providing good service through the years. And I feel confident that with the commitment that that will continue if the merger is approved by the commission. There is a concern also with the fact that, as I mentioned, Avangrid owns a lot of wind resources as an affiliate. And the concern of some of the parties is that when PNM or when the new entity, increases its renewable energy, they're going to unduly favor the affiliate, which could have, and the affiliate may not be the best provider of renewable, but there's the concern, and that's a concern a lot with regulation, that when a utility affiliate gets involved, the utility may favor the affiliate, and that could be at the expense of customers.
Okay, so first and foremost, Avangrid, I guess their main operations in the state of Maine have really been the focus of a lot of attention in the editorial pages of the Albuquerque Journal. There's been folks from Maine writing in pro and cons, saying, they are terrible, or they're fine, or they're great, or whatever. So do you know exactly where their service areas currently are? I'm talking about Avangrid, of course, in the Eastern United States. You mentioned New York. I wasn't
New
aware of that.
York too has penalized not only Avangrid, their entity, their subsidiary, but also some of the other utilities. New York has strict standards, and I think they have what's called performance standards. They set a target, and if you don't achieve the target, you're going to be penalized. And the Avangrid entity has been penalized in the past, as well as other utilities. In Central Maine, yeah, they haven't had a good record there, or in Maine, I should say. The entity is called Central Maine, but they're owned by Avangrid. And, and according to statistics, they actually have had one of the worst reliability performance in the whole country for utilities.
You said
But
they have the
Maine,
worst?
well, one of the worst. I'm
One of the
not sure
worst.
if they're
Okay.
the worst.
Okay.
But you have to understand, when you evaluate utilities on reliability, it depends on factors, not just management, but the geography. Maine has very severe winters. Maine has a lot of trees. And you would expect the reliability, because of those two things, to be less than what they would be in other parts of the country.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask you is, when we focus a lot on reliability issues in utilities, the main one that comes to mind is generally renewables and their performance. And of course, with New Mexico in the throes of the Energy Transition Act, I think there's justified concern about reliability, but reliability can be a lot of different things, including, as you said, trees just knocking down power lines, etc. What reliability issues, generally speaking, are there with regard to utilities that aren't necessarily caused by renewables or their outages, just too much demand? There's other issues with reliability. What are those?
Yeah, well, the reliability issue, a lot of it's caused by weather. I mean, most of the outages that uh, power companies experience comes at the distribution level. And a lot of it's because of severe weather, fallen trees, okay, and lines, if you have very severe weather, hurricanes. Um, so that's an issue. That's sort of at the local, at the local level, where it's important to have to have good reliability, and there's a lot of things that could be done by utilities to determine reliability, like vegetation management and how much they invest in feeders and so forth and so on. So, but we know from the experiences like in Texas back in February, reliability is so paramount. That's probably the number one concern of regulators, utility regulators, is to make sure that customers are getting reliable service. We know, Paul, I know there's a knowledge, it impairs activity and, has a high cost. So it's very important, crucial for utilities to provide highly reliable service. And that's what the regulators expect from their utilities. And, for the most part, utilities do a great job in that. Uh, but but there's situations where some do not, and the question is, as a regulator, how do you make sure that the utilities are providing reliable service? You could go like in New York, have incentive mechanisms. You set a target. If the utility doesn't meet it, then they get penalized. If they go over it, then maybe they get a reward. That could be part of the performance indicator. My preferred approach is to have the utilities report their reliability data periodically, and then for the staff and other, the stakeholders to evaluate that. If it looks like, for a particular period, the reliability was low, for example, there were more, frequent outages of longer duration, then the staff and the stakeholders could evaluate that and present their case, and for the commission to decide whether the utility should be penalized or not.
So is that something that would be added in to this discussion by the PRC, that they would set various reliability standards as a part of the sale?
Um, that could be like a standard or benchmark, and um, and I think that's part of the commitment now in the current stipulation. Now the question is, you have a benchmark. What does that indicate? Um, my preference is to indicate, the benchmark is how you define it, sort of expected performance. And if the utility doesn't meet that level, then perhaps they should be penalized. But what I would prefer is, okay, that could be a red flag. These are gross measures. Okay, frequency went up by 10% this year or 20% over last year. Does that mean the utility should be penalized because they were imprudent, or was it because of, things beyond its control? Which I think in most cases would be, would be the answer, would be the explanation. But again, that would, yeah, a benchmark. If they don't meet it, the utility, then you could just ask the utility, well, why didn't you beat this benchmark? Why do you, you know, um, your reliability level was lower this year, quite a bit lower than last year. Explain to us, and
Mhm.
then you go from there.
So I think it's worth taking a brief step back and talking about some of the parameters of this sale. PNM is, of course, like I said, the largest utility in the state of New Mexico. It's a regulated utility, and I'd like you to explain exactly what that means. And what is Avangrid getting? Because they paid a healthy premium. When it comes to stocks and investing, people tend to think of utilities as the most boring investments
Mm.
you can make in the stock market. But when it comes to the premium that was paid by Avangrid, certainly they seem to think that there's a lot of value to be added at this stodgy old government regulated utility. So talk about the deal and its parameters and what you think Avangrid thinks they're getting.
Yeah, let me, the first part, the regulation, of course, they will continue to be regulated by the PRC, okay?
Mhm.
In terms of distribution and the price it charges customers. And the commission will have also responsibility over reliability level, will have responsibility over siting, providing or giving out certificates for new construction facilities. Um, so that's not going to, that would not change, with Avangrid being the owner now. Um, the One of the concerns, I suppose, would be that since Avangrid or PNM would be under, owned by Avangrid, who's in turn owned by uh, Iberdrola, the Spanish utility, that becomes more complicated for regulators to regulate correctly because you have this sort of holding structure that would sort of make it more difficult for the commission to decide whether, whether the company's providing or shifting costs over to the PNM and doing other things which would jeopardize the interests of consumers. Okay, um, but New Energy Economy, I just read something they wrote. They claim that it won't be regulated or regulation would be jeopardized, with this merger, and that's, in my opinion, would not be true. Um, Now, what was the other question is why, why is Avangrid so interested in this? What's the advantage to
Yeah,
them?
what's the premium being paid? It's pretty
Yeah,
significant.
yeah, the premium, usually if you sort of look back, I mean, step back a little bit, why firms merge, why they, um, in say the unregulated market, a lot of times they go in there and they expect to be more efficient. Maybe the management of the company that they're targeting is inadequate, incompetent, and they feel they could go in there with better management and reduce costs and just have the company perform better. And as a result, if they perform better, then they profit, and that would be reflected in the future stock price. Um, in this case, there's no claim that there's going to be any synergy or more cost efficiency um, if the merger goes through. A lot of the recent mergers in the electric industry are what's called strategic mergers. They the company may want to position itself better uh, to sell. Um, like in this case, renewable energy. Avangrid may feel it would like to get into the Western market more, and with PNM's transmission system to be able to market their renewable energy more. Okay. Um, They also claim that this would give them more diversity in terms of geographic, because as I mentioned before, their other regulated entities are all located in the Northeast. So this would provide more diversity um, for them. And from PNM's perspective, I guess, or from the public interest, Avangrid has a lot, financially in really good shape, and they have this expertise and knowledge in renewable energy, probably more than PNM. So there may be a benefit there from that. But these things are hard to quantify. That's sort of part of the problem of, you could allege benefits from something, but if you can't really quantify and just talk about it, then that gives it less credibility. Um, but those are basically as I understand it, the benefits, and they are somewhat speculative. Um, but for example, if Avangrid has better credit, a better financial position than PNM would, then they could borrow money at lower cost. You know, so if you're going to invest a lot in you need capital, and you could do it at lower cost of capital, that could benefit customers, right? Um,
Mhm.
so it's
So,
those are some of the reasons. But a lot of times mergers, as you know, Paul, in other contexts aren't successful.
mhm.
Um, a lot of times, and the empirical studies have shown that the biggest beneficiaries are the stockholders of the target company, but not the shareholders of the company that's acquiring another one.
Right.
Uh,
Now, according to Utility Dive, an October 21st, 2020 article, uh, the merger represents a 10% premium over PNM's share price at the market close when it was announced, and a 19.3% premium over the average share price during the previous 30 days. So a fairly significant premium there. Now, one might ask, well, with this Energy Transition Act, the shift to 100% renewables coming in a traditional market, you're saying, well, Avangrid's going to have to spend a ton of money on new wind and solar projects and batteries and the whole 9 yards in order to uh, achieve their renewable goals and the state's renewable mandates. But on the, when you're looking at a regulated utility, that just gets put into the price that people at the consumers are paying.
right.
Do you think that the financials of this merger, from what you're familiar with, seem to indicate that New Mexicans are going to be paying a pretty steep premium for this transition to renewable energy in the years
Uh,
ahead?
yeah, I mean that gets into the question of renewable energy, I guess, since the state's mandating it. And I've written on this, and I think it's going to be costly to ratepayers, um, and we could go on. I could talk about how it could jeopardize reliability too. You get
Hmm.
into that issue. One of the problems with renewables is that uh, it's regarded as a intermittent resource, which means that the availability of it depends on the weather, right? On cloud cover or wind conditions and all that. So um, and what that means is, and could be costly to customers, which I consider as a hidden cost of renewable, is that if you have resources which are not firm and more uncertain, the utility is going to have more reserve capacity, okay, uh, because of the uncertainty. Um, and that's costly. They're going to have maybe more backup, more storage, or if you have natural gas as a backup, you're going to have more gas in reserve because you can't always count on this resource when you need it. So that's a question. Yeah, going back to Avangrid too, they probably realize that in this transition in New Mexico towards renewable or other non-carbon, I guess. I think the act says 100% non-carbon resources by
No, it's renewable
2030.
according to revised regulations from the PRC. In fact, PNM is selling out of its stake in Palo Verde, the nuclear plant down in Arizona. So this is a very high bar that they're trying to achieve here in New Mexico with regard to renewable energy.
Yeah, and the recent docket too, or well, not recent, but maybe not too long ago, concerning backup for San Juan replacement.
Mhm.
And the commission has committed to storage. There was an issue of whether natural gas could be adequate storage or backup to renewable. And the commission, I believe this is correct, decided that storage is the way to go. And storage is expensive, and uncertain. It's a relatively new technology, and and especially to construct it on a large scale poses a risk to New Mexicans. Um, so that's an issue. But yeah, with this transition, there's going to be potential there for Avangrid to increase its earnings as more of these facilities get into rate base. Utilities make money by how much they put in rate base and the return that's allowed by the commission. So um, as PNM and New Mexico is going through this transformation, is going to require a lot of capital that's going to be included in rate base, and that increases earnings.
Hmm.
It's one of the, I would call it deficiencies of regulation. Um, it's sort of aligned with what's called gold plating, but that's sort of the reality.
Yeah. So you mentioned that inherent conflict because their rates are regulated by the PRC, and the PRC is it's a changing body. Used to be elected. It's moving forward, going to be nominated by the governor, uh, and I would suspect that one of the things that Avangrid is counting on is the ability to raise rates on New Mexico customers moving forward to pay for all this, investment in renewable technology, et cetera, backup and the whole 9 yards. Uh, Now, the governor, certainly current governor, has a strong incentive to make sure that uh, the power system, that the Energy Transition Act that it's creating is efficient, effective, steady, it's reliable. But price is also going to be an issue because if New Mexicans are suddenly getting hit with massive electrical bills, that could be a negative for her as well. So can you kind of tease out some of those conflicting issues inherent in
Well,
this
that's
transition?
that's that's true. I mean, it probably would be true even if the merger fails and PNM is going to have to commit to, the energy legislation. In my opinion, the rates are going to go up, and and, and there is a conflict. My opinion, knowing what's going on around the country pretty well, there's this trade-off now, and with the politics that um, trying to promote carbon or non-carbon resources, clean energy, and all that. Uh, in my opinion, people are paying too little attention to what's going to happen to price. Okay, and that's one of the costs of trying to deal with climate change. And as a side note too, mandating renewable energy as a way to deal with climate change, studies have shown is very inefficient, very costly. Um, there was a study done by the University of Chicago a while back that indicates that these renewable standards not only will have a significant effect on increasing rates to customers, it would reduce carbon, okay, CO2, but at a very high cost. There's a lot cheaper ways of doing it. Um, Studies have shown that the social cost of carbon may be around $50 per metric ton, which means that for every um, unit of carbon that's emitted, every ton, there's a social cost of $50, which is subject to a lot of error, of course, estimation. But the study that the analysts did indicate that these renewable standards could cost as much as like $600 per metric ton, to reduce carbon, which is very, very, very inefficient. Um, so what that means is that even if you sort of agree that there, we should try to address climate change and reduce carbon, that doing it the way New Mexico is attempting to do it through renewable standards and mandates, it's extremely costly. And who's going to end up paying for that, of course, are the electric customers
Mhm.
mostly. And disproportionately, it's going to fall on low income households because they consume a higher percentage of their income for electricity.
Yeah, of course. And they not only rely on it more, but their bills are a bigger percentage of their overall expenses. So it's definitely another regressive tax on
Right.
lower income folks. Um, so let's run through a few of the pros and cons of Avangrid versus PNM. Now, I do suspect, just as an outside observer, uh, that Avangrid will win its approval. But one of the concerns that a lot of folks have about Avangrid, a company that ultimately is really based in Spain, that's where the big decisions will all be made, as opposed to right here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. PNM is a local company. It's been the largest publicly traded company in New Mexico for a very long time. And that says a lot about New Mexico's economy, just right there. But the fact is that, PNM gives a lot of money. They play an outsized role in a lot of discussions and donation to various nonprofit organizations. Do you think that's going to be a significant issue in this merger discussion? How big of an issue do you think it'll be moving forward, assuming the merger goes through?
Yeah, I think it's, some parties have raised that. Uh, if you replacing a local company with this foreign utility could have, some dire consequences or adverse. I don't think that's true because the reason utilities give money and that's for goodwill, um, improves their image, you know, um, in the community as well as with the regulators and the politicians and all that. And I don't think that would change with this merger because Avangrid would do the same. I mean, we have the same incentives, to pay a positive image of itself in the community. Okay, if only to give more favorable treatment by the regulators and the legislature. They don't want to be the bad guys, and I assume they've, in their experiences in the Northeast, that but it's an empirical question whether they have, uh, whether they actually, when they took over, like in Maine, that was a local company too, Central Maine Power, and then the Avangrid took over, and whether they have given less to charity, whether they have been, not as good citizens, in the community and all that. Um, that's be determined. But because they would have, Avangrid would have similar incentives as PNM. I don't think that would. I don't think that's a concern, even though some parties have raised it as such.
No,
Um,
okay.
but they do want the issues come up whether an independent board who would sit on the board. Okay,
Mhm.
and some parties in the merger case are requiring that there be more not only independent board people but local.
Okay. So let's handicap this process moving forward. Now, uh, my understanding is that the hearing, I believe, is getting started here in August, so right around the corner. But talk about the process with the PRC and kind of handicap where you see it heading in terms of the merger.
Yeah, there actually's been hearings. Uh, well, there's testimony filed. I'm not sure if the parties have, uh, in a PRC hearing, usually as people, shareholders or different party stakeholders submit testimony, written testimony, and then they get cross-examined on it. I think they've been cross-examined. There's going to be public comments, as I understand it, in July, where the public could go and speak before the commission. I'm not sure if that's a good idea or not, but that's on the agenda. And
Hmm.
then there's going to be some, I'm not sure what's going to happen in August on that. Um, but where they're at now is there was I think a second stipulation that was agreed to by a lot of the parties, but not everyone has signed off on it. And there's been some concerns with discovery that parties are claiming that PNM Avangrid have concealed some data information and so forth. Um, where I think this is going to go, to sort of answer your basic question, is that there's going to be more concessions made by Avangrid PNM to try to satisfy more of the parties. Okay. There are concerns about, for example, there is a independent evaluator which has charge of making sure that when PNM purchases, let's say, renewable resources, that they're not favoring the Avangrid subsidiary. Okay. And I think that's good. But one concern, which I agree with, is that under the stipulation, PNM will select that evaluator. And I think that, to have any credibility with that, it should be selected by the commission. Okay. So I think there's going to be some more concessions that Avangrid and PNN, they want this to go through so badly. They're going to put more money on the table.
Hmm.
It's unfortunately it's going to come out to sort of a political thing, trying to appease. You could say it's a bribe to get the parties to sign off, or you could look at it the other way too, as an extortion by different stakeholders. If they want,
Right.
PNM and Avangrid to get their support, they're going to have to put more money on the table.
Well, and this is
Um,
one of the kind of the flaws I think a lot of free market analysts would point out about the entire uh, regulated utility model is that uh, in many ways it's kind of just robbing Peter to pay Paul. That money is going to come from somewhere, and it's probably going to wind up. They're not going to take their profits back in Spain or back in Maine or wherever and bring it to New Mexico to provide for these parties. They're going to ultimately have to raise rates to pay those kinds of those fees off. Am I wrong about that in any way?
yeah, I don't know. That's sort of a question I have because one of the concessions is that the new entity would hire more employees. At one point, it was 100. It could still be 100. My question is, who's going to pay for those new employees, right? Everyone likes new jobs and that was, one of the things that, okay, we're not going to lay off people, we're going to hire actually more people, but someone has to pay for that. Yeah, I'm not sure whether it's going to be the customers or the shareholders that'll pay for it. I would guess it's the customers, right? If there's, if those are actual legitimate costs or at least costs incurred by the new entity, then they'll try to pass it along to customers. So I think that's certainly yeah, these concessions. Some of the other ones, I think, when they say we're going to have low income people, we're going to for help people that are behind on their bills. That's one of the concessions that will help them to repay their debt to the utility or their what's called arrearages, what they owe, and all that. I I assume that will come out of the shareholders. I don't think, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Rather
Hmm.
than the customers. But I think there's a lot in this. It's my impression um, that they want this PNM and Avangrid for this to go through so badly that they'll pour out more money on the table.
Yeah.
To get more support. Um, and it's going to come down to the hearing examiner too. Well, it's going to come down to the commission making a decision. But under the rules of the commission PRC, the hearing examiner writes a recommended order that goes to the commission.
Hmm.
Um, and more times than not, commissions or this commission actually will agree with the hearing examiner. But since this is a high profile case, with high high stakes, that may not be the case. I'm not sure. I think that this is going to get approved, but I think
Hmm.
after more money is bestowed to the different stakeholders. Not everyone's going to sign off on this, but that's not necessary, for the
Right.
commission to approve. Of course, the commission would like to have more parties sign off on it, but to me, that's it's not a requirement that they all do, because I don't think they all will, no matter what's placed on the table.
All right. Well, Ken, are you planning on writing any more about this? If people want to check out your existing writings on it, where can they find it?
Uh, yeah, I don't know on this issue. I was thinking of writing something, but I wrote that op-ed, and I've been doing a lot of thinking on this and that, and yeah, I may go ahead and put something down on paper, but more in terms of mergers in general.
Hmm.
Um, if you look at the electric industry over the last few decades, uh, there's been a lot of mergers. Okay, you had a lot more local utilities, decades ago than you do now. So there's been a lot of mergers going on in the industry. So this isn't unique. Um, the earlier mergers were based more on synergy and reducing costs. The recent ones, as I mentioned earlier, are more what they call strategic mergers. Okay, and it's interesting. Is this a good or bad merger? And one cannot, you know, one could have opinions on this and all that. But one sort of last thing on this is that, since the shareholders are going to be better off, um, and there's rate credits to customers, like what, $50 million. There's other benefits to customers. They add like 20 some million, and these other concessions. One could argue it's in the public interest in the sense that, okay, it seems like the customers will be better off to some extent. The shareholders are better off. So there's a net benefit to New Mexico. But,
Hmm.
there's so much uncertainty um, associated with these things, that the commission should monitor and make sure that, if the merger goes through, that the entity meets its commitments, and do an evaluation whether the merger seems to have been good for the state. Now, in other contexts, in other states, I don't think there's been, um, any systematic analysis which sort of answers that question. We did something. It sort of comes out to what's called risk analysis too. In a lot of policies, public policies, the question for the policymaker is, if we do this, what's the risk? If we don't do this, there's also a risk. In the
Hmm.
case of the merger, if the commission doesn't approve it, then there's a risk that there's foregone benefits that could have otherwise accrued to the customers and to the state of New Mexico. On the other half, you approve the merger, um, there are risks that, there could be problems, there could be favoritism that even, with the commitments and that aren't going to overcome. There could be other, risks to the state and customers. So, if I were a commissioner, I would then sort of evaluate, what's the risk of each type of decision. And as of now, I would, for what it's worth, would say, okay, I think let's go ahead and do this. And I think the risks are minimal. The benefits are uncertain, and they're not that large to customers, but you know, maybe it's something that should be done.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time and knowledge there, Ken Costello. Again, you can find some of his writing at riograndefoundation.org, as well as on Google, just under his name. And, he writes a lot about utility issues here in New Mexico and around the country. And thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.
Thank you, Paul.